Juli Bierwirth, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much.
It's really exciting to have you. You and I had some really interesting conversations about all the fun science stuff that nobody talks about in the coffee industry, and I'm super stoked that you're joining us because we're going to talk about some of that stuff here.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have a chance to talk about it. It seems like the coffee industry is really built around, obvious flagship products, and as it starts to branch out, really requires a lot better understanding of the food science elements involved.
Yeah, so you're a food scientist, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's the difference between a food scientist and a food technologist? So I was thinking about that this morning because when I was at university, we were all like, you should go be a food technologist. They kept saying that to us. That's where the future of science is, in food tech. Is there a difference?
Heck if I know. They always offered that as an option in my program too, where you could do food science and food technologist. And
yeah,
I remember it being a shorter program to do food technology, but I'm not entirely sure what those folks were doing that was different from what we were. But my work was mostly everyone in food science has to do like a set curriculum, and then you do a lot of stuff with a specific region. So mine was antioxidants in blackberries. So I spent a long time researching antioxidants in blackberries. Other folks look at norovirus or the way that bacteria grow in ice. There's just everything in the world to study about food.
I want to talk to you about bacteria and mold in coffee.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about, and we've only got a couple of hours, so I want to make sure that we dig deep into it. I know people think that that's a long time, but I swear a couple of hours goes just like that, especially when you and I are talking.
For talkative people. Yeah, it's pretty easy to tell.
So let's talk about, where to start. So I want to talk first of all about fermentation and what role that plays with the back end of the coffee supply chain. So there's bacteria everywhere. There's mold everywhere. There's yeast everywhere. There's all the bugs, the flora, when we're breathing and when we're eating and drinking, and all these things naturally occur in the environment. So obviously you are going to get these things at origin.
Yeah.
And I'm suspecting that as you're processing all of these things, you are adding variables to the process that are going to either enhance or inhibit the growth of these bugs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk to us a little bit about the journey that those bugs have from the back end of the supply chain during processing, and how do they end up or get removed from the supply chain as they get to the green coffee to the roastery?
Yeah, so I think the thing we primarily hear and think about in terms of green beans is mold. I mean, the reason that we have a specific moisture content that we want in those beans, the reason we have Grain Pro around those beans is to really prevent mold. Mold is our most hardy of all the microorganisms. It can really grow in a lot of different environments. And for our green beans, and especially because they sort of fall into the same category as grains, they can grow aflatoxin and ochratoxin, some molds that actually produce really damaging mycotoxins, which are the poisons essentially produced by certain types of mold, like aspergillus and everything. So for us, the name of the game for at least the green bean end is preventing mold growth. And as long as that moisture content is really low, lower than 12%, then we're pretty good for preventing mold. But the processing up to that end really does make a difference. However, as our beans get dried, that's going to be inhibiting the mold as well. It's really, the mold loves a moist and dark environment. And so if you're buying beans they're in a dark environment, they're in those bags, free from light, and it's not moist in there, then you're good. If they're in a moist environment, but there's lots and lots of light, then you have the opportunity to prevent that mold, which would be more what we see at origin, right? We see patios where things are wet and they're getting dry, but we don't see a lot of piles of mold forming on top of these beans, and part of it is because they're often dried outside, and the heat that's generated during that drying process also helps to prevent those molds. But that's really our concern with the green beans. However, the roasting process is sort of the next step that then prevents mold and mold toxins from being an issue for the end consumer. Most of what we think about in terms of bacteria and mold and yeast and coffee, it's for the end consumer. We're worried about whoever's drinking that coffee is going to have some sort of reaction or adverse, maybe gastrointestinal effect from that coffee. And because we have a heat kill step at the roast, that roast is going upwards of 400 degrees Fahrenheit, that's going to then mean that we're getting a really decent heat kill on not just the organisms, but we're also getting enough heat to damage the toxins that are produced in that process too. And then, we have these nice dry beans afterwards, these nice dry roasted beans that aren't going to grow anything. They might harbor things until
Spores.
they can grow later. Yeah, there might be spores. There might even be, some of the research surrounding vegetative bacteria in recent years has changed because I think it was the Peanut Butter Corporation of America had a big salmonella incident a while back, and everyone thought, salmonella can't grow in peanut butter because where's the water? It's all oil in peanut butter. But their factory was so mismanaged, and they had drips of water coming down from the ceiling into their peanut butter, and so there's been a lot of sort of change in thought about they're not necessarily going to grow, but they can exist, they can live, and they won't necessarily die in a really low moisture environment. And so it's still, we still have to think about handling of the beans and be considerate with making sure that you're not ill and touching beans, and you're not introducing moisture somewhere along the supply chain. But for the most part, the coffee industry has benefited forever from having a very shelf-stable, food-safe product. And so a lot of people in coffee haven't really had to think about this stuff at any point. And now, and it's kind of coming around now, finally, that people are getting into cold brew. And what you have is an entire industry of people who've never had to think about the food safety involved. And now you have something like cold brew, which is just like the biggest nightmare for food safety that there ever could be, because there's no heat kill step in the formation of this product. And so it becomes, depending on how you make it. So it really becomes a big issue when people who are in the coffee industry making, roasting their own coffee, brewing their own coffee, serving hot coffee, all of that stuff, then step into cold brew without somebody to alert them to the microbiological concerns and risks that they're posing by getting into that game, and even the liability that they're taking on, that they might get a consumer sick, or business can even be shut down, and CEOs can be found financially liable for negligence on the food safety end. So it really is important to, if you're going to step out into that, to have somebody talking to you about how to take care of that product.
Absolutely. And we're so glad that we have you, we being Elixir Specialty Coffee, that we could give you a call and have you as a part of the people who are advising us. And I mentioned to you that everyone around me that were in food safety, they were all telling me, you've got nothing to worry about, because any coffee beverage is not considered a potentially non-hazardous food product.
Yeah. So the FDA really hasn't quite caught up with
right.
And so it really depends on how it's made. Some sometimes they're right. Sometimes that cold brew is not going to be a big concern. It certainly depends on how you treat it, if you're pasteurizing. But I mean, basically anything can be safe as long as you go through essentially canning processes, right? Like we developed canning 100 years ago now, and we can make just about anything safe as long as you have enough heat and enough time and, you know, potentially a high pressure environment. But the question is, can you do that in a way that doesn't damage the flavors associated with the coffee? Is it still considered something like cold brew if you're going through this, you know, really intensive heating step? But also, you know, what we traditionally use for beverages, most beverages that you're buying off the shelf that are food safe have either some acids or some preservatives or enough sugar in them to prevent the outgrowth of bacteria or mold or yeast. And that's what makes them shelf stable after it's been heated a certain amount. So, you know, as an example, your soda's a really low pH. Usually things like Coke has phosphoric acid added into it, and that phosphoric acid makes it sour, but it also helps to prevent microorganism growth. It's also got sugar, and sugar is another hurdle step that's helping to prevent microorganism growth. When you add enough of these hurdles together, something won't grow in that environment. It might still need to be heat treated because you have to kill off anything that would grow. But you know, one of the big examples for the coffee industry, if you're doing something like cold brew and you're doing it in a sealed bottle, is that you're creating an anaerobic environment. And that anaerobic environment, you know, eventually all of the oxygen gets used up by the product. And you created an environment where anaerobic bacteria can grow. And some of those are really harmful. The really big one is Clostridium Botulinum. And that's what the entire canning industry has been designed around. So Clostridium Botulinum is a really cool organism. It forms these spores, which basically, you know, protective outer shell. And if it's in an environment where it can't live, it just goes into the shell and sort of hibernates and waits for more ideal conditions. And so Clostridium Botulinum it's in our soil. It's almost everywhere. It's pretty ubiquitous on planet Earth. But there's only certain situations in which it likes to grow, and obviously we're surrounded by oxygen, so we don't see it a lot. You know, you're not going to see it as a big concern for, you know, your fruits and your vegetables, anything that's fresh, your meats, anything that has oxygen surrounding it. But then the minute you take away oxygen, which is what canning is all about, you suddenly create a really ideal growing environment for it. And you can make that environment less ideal. So Clostridium Botulinum does not like to grow below a pH of 4.6. So if you make a really acidic product, you don't have to worry about it. That's why a lot of sodas, juices, and stuff like that you see canned, those are acidic, and tomato products you usually don't have to worry about it. Tomatoes are pretty acidic. But then if you have a low acid product, let's say green beans is a really great example. We don't like to have really acidic green beans. You can consider that a low acid product, and it has to be treated in order to kill the spores. And those are hardier than normal bacteria. So it has to be treated at a higher temperature for a higher amount of time. That is part of why green beans as a product, like canned green beans, taste so strange, because they're not going to taste like fresh green beans. They've undergone a pretty decent heat treatment. But the big thing about Clostridium Botulinum is it's extremely deadly. It's the same stuff that they put in Botox. That's bot toxin. So Clostridium Botulinum is a paralytic. So people inject it into their face, obviously, to paralyze their muscles. But if you consume it in too great quantities, it'll paralyze your lungs and you'll suffocate.
That sounds horrible.
It's absolutely terrible. And part of the reason why we don't see it a lot is because the whole industry was, designed around it. But then you bring in something like coffee, where we're not used to canning things, we're not used to pasteurization, and so you're getting people who are, bottling cold brew. And I think it was Death Wish coffee, maybe a year or so ago.
I heard about this. The blog post that came out, they did a recall, right?
Which is an ironic name, of course, for
exactly. I remember thinking the same thing.
Yeah, they did a recall for concerns of Clostridium Botulinum. And so, you start to get into this much more serious territory when you're getting into bottling things and canning things. And that's where you need, someone to come in who can help you on the regulatory end, working with FDA and things like that, but then also helping you on the logistic end, making sure that your process is, sanitary, your heat process is sufficient to kill spores if that's what you're doing, or your pH is low enough consistently. And it's not always in cold brew. Certain types of beans get more acidic or less acidic. But you need to make sure that, all of those hurdles that are helping to prevent the Clostridium botulinum always are always tested for in every single batch that you create, that you're really consistent about making a very safe product. And that's something I've found to be pretty new to coffee producers who are interested in getting into the cold brew game. It's a big investment, and it's a lot of liability to take on.
People kept telling me, "What are you worried about? You've got insurance." I'm like, "It's."
Yeah.
Do you hear that?
Yeah, no. I mean, that would be great comfort if somebody came to see you because their spouse died drinking your coffee, and then
But the thing is,
you'd be like, well, at least I had insurance,
right. And my thing is, like, listen, my number one life currency is peace of mind. And yes, insurance is awesome and we have it. And no matter what would happen to our business, we're covered because we've got loads of insurance. But I don't want to have insurance to use insurance. I want to have insurance and never have to use it. Like, at the end of the day, I want to create a product that does no harm, that people enjoy, and makes people want to have more of the experience. I don't want to go to sleep every night stressing about whether my product has the potentiality to ruin a family or to end somebody's life. It's a serious thing. And it's why I really wanted to have you on the podcast, because I don't think people are taking what we do seriously enough and the potentiality it has for doing some serious harm to people.
Well, and the funny thing is that I think that cold brew is sort of this perfect storm of, like a lot of food products that exist. It's sort of like it was an experiment. Starts out as an experiment. People try it and then they keep it in their fridge for a long time and look, it's still okay. And so there's this false sense of security that we get because it does seem like, coffee is really not an ideal growth environment for bacteria. Like, it doesn't have a lot of sugar in it. It's not a lot for it to eat. It's got natural antimicrobials in the antioxidants that are in chlorogenic acid and caffeic acid and things like that. Those are natural antimicrobials, and they're presumably, I think the theory is that they're really preventing the growth of even bacteria that we inoculate cold brew with. So there was a study recently, I think it was Salmonella and E. coli, where they, or Salmonella and Listeria, they inoculated cold brew with Salmonella and Listeria, and then watched as, over weeks and weeks, the bacterium just died. They didn't grow.
That's great.
Flourish in that environment. Yeah, and it is great. But just because it's true about one bacterium does not mean that it's going to be true about another. And so I think we've had a long history of, making cold brew and people don't get sick, and it's like, oh, that's great. So let's move forward with it. And part of that is it's partly chance and luck. You might have a batch of cold brew that's low enough in pH that nothing's growing in it. Part of it is, how it's being stored. So a lot of cold brew has been, people make it on site, they store it, they keep a concentrate and then store it over a matter of days. Not that many cold brew products, like compared to the rest of the market, not that many cold brew products exist where people are bottling and shipping. And once you get into that anaerobic environment, that's where you get a lot of concerns. So I think that creates sort of a new set of challenges to overcome. And the chance for CBOT seems like really that's the microorganism of concern here. And there are steps that you can take to mitigate that if you're creating a product and it's not acidic enough. You can add acids. You can add back organic acids that occur naturally in the coffee, and what it's going to taste like, the influence on the flavor. Granted, the ingredient list is going to have to list the organic acid that you added back. And so like citric acid or malic acid, you'll have to report that, sure. But it's just going to taste like a slightly more, bright coffee. The way you get, Africans and Ethiopians, and they have this brightness to them sometimes. It's going to taste like that. If you're adding back those organic acids, then you can get the pH low and have it taste still like a normal coffee, granted a slightly more acidic one. Or you can, source beans that are particularly acidic. But it's not just like you can do whatever you will with
well, we've learned that.
And it'll always be fine,
We've definitely learned that with Elixir. There are different coffees that have different acidities. There are different brew times that have different levels of acidity. The way that we heat treat the Elixir when we're hot filling affects the acidity. All of these things we would never have known to check, and now we do know to check, and we are checking, and we're keeping records, and et cetera, et cetera. Excuse me, but it's nowhere near as straightforward or simple as people would expect.
Yes. And I think that's the thing, is that the coffee industry hasn't had to check stuff like that before. And because cold brew became a product, and it just seems like it works, right? Like, it just didn't go bad that often. And when it did, you'd be able to see it because there was yeast or mold or something on the top, and then you just toss it. And it seems like a spoilage issue instead of a dangerous pathogen issue. And so, but it is an issue for dangerous pathogens. And if the big one of concern is Clostridium Botulinum, that's something to take very seriously, because that is such a deadly microorganism. And no coffee company wants that on their record. That's a company killer also,
Well, it's an industry killer, to be honest with you. Sorry to cut you off there. My concern for it is not just that it will ruin a business. If there was an event of Clostridium Botulinum, people will stop buying cold brew.
Yeah.
And it ruins the industry. People will start thinking twice about drinking coffee. And we will have a real problem as an industry if there is even one case of that comes up, because the press will have a field day with it.
Yeah, and actually, the thing is, we really don't see a lot of outbreaks of CBOT because the industry is designed around it. The most that you really see CBOT, there's a few like interesting scenarios that come up that are really consistent. One is, you go to like an Italian restaurant or something, and you see the olive oil with garlic cloves in it.
Yep.
Those garlic cloves need to be cooked. If you put a raw clove of garlic in oil and just let it sit, you've created an anaerobic environment, because you've surrounded that garlic clove with an atmosphere that's poor in oxygen, and then that garlic clove almost invariably has CBOT on it, because CBOT is found in dirt. And so if you leave that in there, that will it will grow. It will turn back from a spore to its vegetative bacterium, and then it will produce the bot toxin. And most of the people who die from CBOT is from either poorly attempted home canning accidents, or somebody putting garlic and olive oil like that. Like, there's very specific situations, and there are moments where people inadvertently created an anaerobic environment. And they just wouldn't have known better. And to me, it's really amazing that people don't get hurt more often like that. But there's also reasons why we sort of pass down this legacy of cooking from, parents to children and so on. It does sort of beg a question of, with less and less culinary education that's happening in children from generation to generation, if this is going to become a rising problem. But I've heard of people who say like, but my grandmother, she used to keep this soup on the stove for like a week. She'd never put it in the refrigerator. And it was never fun. It was never a problem. We never got sick. And it was always like, well, if she put the lid on and then boiled it for 10 minutes before you ate it, she was probably growing tons of bacteria in there, and she just killed them all off with really intense heat treatment. Like, there are ways in which we've sort of gotten around this as a species historically. And they're ideally not always the ways that you want to bank your whole business on or your whole industry on. And so understanding how and why these bacteria grow and what kind of environments cause them to flourish. The reason that cold brew is really a big concern is because unlike hot brew, it doesn't have that heat kill step. Our normal hot brewing of coffee, we're using temperatures like pretty close to our boiling point, like 95 Celsius or so. And so what you're seeing is a heat treatment similar to pasteurization, the same way that we were pasteurized to make things sterile or shelf stable. You're seeing a pasteurization temperature that, if there is anything on the beans, if there's anything in the water, it's now not going to be a concern the same way as that grandmother boiling something on the stove. But, you take cold brew and let's say you have some salmonella on those beans. Salmonella may not be growing, the beans are too dry, but it got on because of, either through the air or mishandling of
your hands
or something. Yeah. And then you just add water to that. And what you've done is created this
instant salmonella soup.
Liquid environment. And maybe salmonella is not an issue because maybe the antimicrobials in that coffee inhibits the salmonella. Great. But salmonella is not the only concern. There's E. coli, there's CBOT. There's so many different bacteria that we need to be worried about, or bacteria that we need to be worried about. And it's really important to know, which ones, why they're concerning. And then you always basically treat things based on the hardiest of all of those bacteria. And CBOT is almost always the hardiest of them all. Sorry, my boss is making eyes at me.
Hello, boss making eyes at you.
That sounded bad. He's just trying to make me awkward on a podcast.
You gotta love men in coffee, don't you? So what advice do you have for those people who, I know that there are hundreds of cafes out there that are doing this, and I would like to hear them to hear it from your mouth. What advice do you have for the cafes that are taking the cold brew that they have left at the end of every day and putting it into little bottles and putting lids on it and then putting a little seal over it and then putting it in their fridge for people to buy as a bottle that they can take home?
Yeah, so I would say that there's definitely a shelf life on that. You can go through a lab and get that tested. So you can look at your specific coffee. You can actually have it inoculated. You can go through challenge testing, which is, one way of telling if you have potential to grow something in that coffee. But a pretty safe bet is that you're going to be able to, after you've made that, you're going to be able to keep it for about 3 weeks, and then you've absolutely got to toss it. Even though it's lidded, it does need to be refrigerated. So that's going to be one of the temperatures is one of the hurdle steps. And the CBOT's not going to grow very well in a cold environment like that. But, you can pretty safely guarantee a 3-week shelf life as long as it is refrigerated the whole time, which means also that if you're shipping it out to a customer, you need to make sure that it stays within that refrigeration temperature on the whole shipping chain, which means either you have refrigerated cooled packaging or refrigerated trucks, whatever that means. You can't bring it in and out of that refrigeration zone without shortening pretty significantly that shelf life. And you might even still, depending on how you're making that product, you might still at the end of that 3 weeks see something like yeast and mold, because maybe the air quality in the area where you're making that cold brew is not filtered, not sufficient enough to prevent lots of spores and lots of yeast from inoculating your cold brew. So it's something that you can sell. It's not unlike making juice and bottling it and selling it, but it's got to be refrigerated and it's got to be tossed at the end of a certain period. And I found 3 weeks to be an appropriate amount of time, but that doesn't mean you can keep it off. You can keep it on the shelf. That doesn't mean you can ship it without cold packaging or cold transport.
And labeling is super important in that situation, right?
Yes, absolutely.
It's got to say on there, it needs to be kept refrigerated.
Yeah. must say keep refrigerated, must say it's use by date. And the funny thing is that in the industry, those use by dates are not, we're not bound to them. There's sort of a bit of consumer responsibility in all of this where, you know, if there was some sort of incident, let's say somebody kept your cold brew for 3 weeks past when they were supposed to and drank it anyway and then got sick, you could deny responsibility for that by saying, look, there was a use by date, you know, this lot, they were all labeled with this, and this person ignored that use by date. That would be considered as part of the evidence of whether you were negligent in the creation of this product. But those are not, they're not like strictly enforced. When, you know, when your eggs say best by, use by, those are also quality standards. And consumers are more than welcome to consume, you know, after that date. And if something goes wrong before that date, that doesn't necessarily mean that the manufacturer is culpable for that either.
Okay.
So that is a way that companies protect themselves and also protect the quality of their product by trying to get people to consume it while it's a good representation of what that company produces. You don't want them to consume it when it's really oxidized or, you know, unpleasant. But it doesn't have a lot of legality around it, if that makes sense.
It does.
So not terribly enforced.
And
how long you have.
And for anyone that's listening to this, just to qualify this, Juli works for 1,000 Faces Coffee. Yes.
These guys. Yeah.
You know, this is something, it is your area of expertise. You are not just pulling the shit out of the air. Like, this is something you deal with on a daily basis for your job. You are specifically implementing these practices for the coffee industry, which is why we hired you, because you know about this stuff. It's not just, oh, I've gone and done a food sciences degree and here, let me see what I can apply for coffee. You work in the coffee industry.
Yeah, I work in the coffee industry, and I work particularly with cold brew. And my main job, I wear a few hats around here, but my main job was sort of to revolutionize the way that we produce cold brew, because it became a bigger and bigger part of our product lineup over the years, and that really meant investing in it the way that you ought to. So when we moved to a new facility, you know, we created a larger cold brew space, and we made sure that we had everything there so that we can keep growing farther, but also that all of these quality measures were in place and all of these safety measures were in place to ensure that this was going to be a product that was safe for our consumers. So yeah, it's been a lot of research and a lot of speaking to people in local and federal agencies to understand, you know, because there isn't legislation specifically around cold brew coffee as a product, you know, what does that mean for us? How do we just make decisions about what it's most like, but then therefore how it needs to be treated and processed?
Is the legislation coming, do you think? Do you think that they're going to catch on to it soon?
I don't know. You can consider it much like a lot of other beverage products. The question that's really interesting to me is it might actually be uniquely different from other beverages. So, you know, in another beverage, if I were to make something where I mix water and flavoring and some sort of an acid, you know, I could pretty well say, as long as I get it below a pH of 4.6, and I have these flavorings, and I have some sugar maybe as a hurdle step against bacteria as well, and all these things I can combine, make a beverage, pasteurize it, and then put it on a shelf and have it be shelf stable. It might be the case, and this is where some of the research is coming in, that coffee has natural antimicrobials that are their own hurdles. When we think about hurdles in microbiology, it's like what would the bacterium have to overcome to be able to still thrive, produce toxins, multiply. And you know, one such hurdle is salt, sugar, anything that decreases the water activity, which is how much water the bacterium can use for its replication or production of a toxin. You can basically think about it as it needs to be able to move around, and it needs to be able to eat and excrete, and if it doesn't have space to do that, it needs to be in this water. But if that water is all being used up by other things, then it's not going to be able to grow well in that environment. And one of our primary cutoffs for water activity is 0.85. So water activity is on a scale of 0 to 1. 1 would be water. And 0 would be something that is absolutely devoid of water, absolutely dry, or where all of the water is bound by something that's it's not freely available for the bacteria.
So it's super concentrated.
Yeah. So even our most like concentrated coffee products is still going to have a pretty high water activity. Anything that has lots of water, anything that's really liquidy, like even your crackers that you get that are really dry might have still a water activity of something like 0.3 or 0.4.
Wow.
So
what about something like maple syrup? Even as viscous as it is, would that have a high water activity?
I would say probably below the 0.85 threshold because so much sugar is in it.
Yeah.
That's part of the reason why we don't see a lot of bacteria growing in maple syrup, but we do see things like mold forming on the top, right?
Yes.
Like that's something that can happen, especially when condensation forms and then dissolves the top of that maple syrup. You'll see mold form. So sugar, salt, all of those things, they bind water. The water gets attracted to them, and they sort of take water out of the equation, or else they do other things to change the behavior. Like we wouldn't be able to live in an extremely salty environment, but neither can some microbes. And so those are considered some hurdles. The acidity is a hurdle. The temperature is a hurdle. And so all of these different things are what the bacteria have to overcome to be able to multiply, grow, and produce toxins. And so you're trying to create an environment where there are lots of hurdles, lots of barriers in place to those bacteria growing. If you have something, however, that has sort of unique elements that we don't usually consider to be these hurdles. So a lot of tabletop cleaners, like this new organic and natural tabletop cleaners, will use like rosemary oil or something like that. Some plants and herbs have natural fungicides and bactericides that kill or at least stop the replication of certain types of microorganisms. And so it's not the acidity, it's not sugar content or salt content, it's something else about the molecular composition of that product. And it might be that coffee has a unique composition that makes it not harbor bacteria in a certain way. I know that it still harbors yeast and mold because
absolutely
that's a big thing that we still concern ourselves with. And those
caffeine itself.
Still grow.
Caffeine itself is an antimicrobial, right?
Yeah. So there are things that definitely are working for our favor in the coffee industry. And so it might be that we don't have to do quite as much processing, but the research has not been there to back that up. And so far it has to be treated like any other food product or beverage product, where if it has a water activity above 4.6, it has to be treated as a low acid food, and therefore has to be heat treated at a much higher temperature, higher than boiling point, which either requires like a salinated, a salty solution, or a high pressure environment, and that is an investment for anyone who is trying to make a product that is going to be put on the shelf. That it's also going to, the more time and the higher temperature we heat things, it's going to have a greater impact on the flavor and oxidation of oils, and all of that stuff is going to be influenced by that kind of
evaporation, TDS. Like it all just changes it. That's what we found for Elixir. I mean, I can't talk too much about it, but we definitely did find that that all of these things affect the way that the product is going to be consumed, the quality and how it tastes and all of that. And it's something that has to be a factor of what we consider. It's no small feat. Like there's people who keep saying to me, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. It's not like it's a non-hazardous food product. And I'm like, my training tells me otherwise. You know,
Yeah.
my
It can be, you know, like if you have a really acidic product, it's not non-hazardous, but it's pretty easy to process something that's really acidic. We have a lot of
but coffee is not like that. That's the problem.
It can be, but then there's times when it's not, and that's certainly what we've seen here on our end in terms of, like, you know, some coffees will get in and they'll easily meet that 4.6 bar. They'll, you know, get below that, and some they'll come in, you know, above 5, and those have to be treated like very, very different products for you know, bottling and canning purposes. The type of treatment that you would do on one versus the other is wholly different to ensure safety, because that you know, pH of 5 coffee, that runs a big risk for your company if you're going to try and bottle it and sell it and create an anaerobic environment and then not put in the primary hurdle for Clostridium botulinum, which is a pH below 4.6.
And that's my concern, is that and why I wanted to have this conversation with you on air, is that I don't know that there's many shops out there that are actually even testing the pH of their cold brew.
Yeah. And the thing is, if they're bottling and refrigerating and then tossing after 3 weeks, that's probably okay. You know, right. Like it's at the refrigeration temperature, that's another hurdle for the Clostridium botulinum. And that 3-week cutoff, you're probably going to see mold and yeast growth before you see any pathogens of concern. However, people don't always comply with those labels. You know, they don't always actually drink by the, you know, that's by date. And
or they'll put it in their handbag and leave it there for 2 days.
Yeah, and then be like, oh, it's still probably fine. Yeah, and granted, those are consumer end mistakes, right? And you can't prevent all of those. But the ones that you can prevent are, you know, if you're shipping out to a facility an hour away and you're saying like, oh, it'll probably be fine. I'll take it out of the fridge. I'll, you know, put it in the boxes and then we'll just drive it on over there. Technically, you can take things out of the refrigerator and you have essentially a 4-hour window for, at least the food industry, you have a 4-hour window in which it can be out of that refrigerator, but it has to get back to its refrigeration temperature within those 4 hours. And still, that time out of refrigeration is going to influence the shelf life. And so that 3 weeks is no longer 3 weeks. It might be 2.5 or it might be 2. And so keeping that cold chain is huge for ensuring that shelf life, even for a refrigerated product.
Because at the end of the day, it goes back to that whole do not harm aspect of things. Like we don't want to have to worry about, you know, having to use insurances or anything like that. Like if we know what we have to protect from, and we know the sun's definitely shining in on you. Right, really it looks very angelic. So this takes me to a part of the conversation that I am personally very interested in at the moment. And you talked about the fact that when someone puts that cold brew in the fridge, and as long as it's consumed within 3 weeks, it should be fine. And the most that they're likely to see is mold and yeast growing on there. And I want to talk about mold because it's something I'm personally very interested in right now. I think that I have some mold toxicity going on with regards to my brain. It's something, you're into functional medicine, you're a nutritionist, you're, you know, that's the other part of your life. Well, one of the other parts of your life. You're also into incredible acrobatic yoga stuff that just looks fascinating every time you post something on it about Facebook. It's just so fucking cool. But, you know, as someone who's spending a lot of time trying to understand what's going on with mold and functional health, and the gut microbiome and the relationship that all of this plays with regards to our health, mold is not something that we actually want to be serving our customers. not just from like the old wives' tales, and like my grandfather and my father used to think it was funny to show us like mold's not going to kill you. So my father would, like, if there was a moldy piece of bread, he'd say things like, "Stop being so precious," and he'd eat a piece of it to show me that it's not going to kill you or anything like that. Right.
Bread molds can be pretty nasty though.
Right. But, my father and his parents, they grew up really poor in a village in Syria. So when they were trying to teach us lessons about stop being so precious, look how much you've got, blah, 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 this was one of those things that he did to be like, it's mold will never kill you. But
Nope.
functional medicine is becoming one of those revealers of how absolutely dangerous mold can be to your health, brain health, your gut health, all of that kind of stuff. And coffee's definitely a place where it can be a breeding ground if you do have it sitting around. Like the number of people that that will get a cold brew and they'll just have it sitting on their counter for a couple of days in a bottle. And that shit is absolutely growing stuff that you don't want to put into your body because you don't know the effect, right?
Yeah, no, yeah, absolutely. So mold spores are in our air, you can get a really nice air purification system that's going to help take some of those out, but guaranteed molds and yeast, they're floating through the air. And that's why if you, if you put something like just flour and water on your counter and mix them together, there's a chance that bacteria will get to it first, but you'll eventually get sourdough, partly because the yeast from the air is going to colonize your dough, the same way that if you were to add yeast from the store into it, it would eventually colonize that dough. And so, that stuff, it's floating around all the time. It's one of the absolute main reasons why, unless you are doing something with really, really good heat treatment of your beverages, like cold brew, because it's not brewed with a heat treatment, and if it's not then pasteurized, the problem isn't that you're using impure water or that your beans have something wrong with them. The problem is your air. Your air is always going to put yeast or mold back into that product, and it might take some amount of time for that to actually grow, but it's there. So yeah, unless you're working in an environment that is sterile, which is what aseptic packaging packages materials that are sterile in containers that are sterile in a sterile environment, you're gonna be dealing with yeast and mold. And so if you're brewing cold brew on your countertop at room temperature, everything's gonna grow slower at refrigeration temperatures, your yeast and your mold too. But if you're brewing it on your countertop, you have introduced yeast and mold, and now you're growing it in a more favorable environment for those yeasts and molds, and you've reduced your shelf life. Once you get to a certain mold count, it is really going to start to have an impact on your health. Mold is usually has usually a greater impact on your health when it's inhaled. It's a really big problem for lungs over time. However, what we also see is people who chronically consume. So like I have a friend who she's a Brita filter and just would drink filtered water all the time. And she was having all these gastrointestinal issues, was going to the doctor trying to figure out what it is she's allergic to, or what's causing all these issues. And then was having me over the course of about a year. And eventually she called me up and she was like, "Oh my gosh, you will not believe what happened. I feel so stupid, but I left my Brita, pitcher on the counter, always, never refrigerated. It was just sitting in the counter. And I thought what was on the inside was condensation and it was white mold. For years, I was leaving that out on the counter.
Wow.
And then filtering it. And then finally I went to go clean it. And then, here I was just like poisoning every glass of water I had for all of this time. And once she started having clean, fresh, healthy water again, lo and behold, her symptoms go away. And so it can be, if you're getting chronically exposed to things like molds, it can be a real long-term issue. the once in a while molds a lot of times won't be an issue, but then, there's certain molds that grow on grains, there's certain molds that grow on cheese that are actually truly deadly. And it's not usually the mold that's deadly, it's they'll often produce
mycotoxins.
Yeah. And Aspergillus flavus, I think, is the one that produces aflatoxin. Aflatoxin is the most potent carcinogen known to man. And there's an area, I did this research when I was at in my master's degree at Hopkins. We were working on creating a beverage that we could put basically it's like a medical protocol that we were doing for this area in China where it's endemic for aflatoxin. The mold grows all over all of their grains, and they try and pick it out, but it's a poor area of China. They can't pick out all the grains. These ducks sit here and eat all the grains, and then the ducks all get liver cancer, and then the people all get liver cancer.
Because they're eating the ducks.
They're eating the ducks, they're eating the grains. Like, it's just impossible to escape. It has the perfect climate for this mold, and it grows all over their grains. And fortunately, we have really great testing protocol in the United States for aflatoxin, and we really diligent about it. And then we are also, we don't have the best climate for it to grow. So our local native crops aren't nearly as big an issue as other parts of the world. But we were testing essentially broccoli sprout extract, which is hopefully preventative of cancer, helps in the process of prevent the process of forming cancer.
Sorry to cut you off there. Is that a part of like with PIM? Because cruciferous vegetables have a lot of inhibitors, right?
Yes. Yeah. So
I've been following lots of Dr. Jess's and Carrie Jones's stuff. Hey, I feel like it's the way of the future of medicine, is understanding these extracts from vegetables and different things is the way that we're going to fix a lot of this shit. So anyway, go on. We're going to have Dr. Jess on the podcast soon, so it'll be great.
So there's a chemical in broccoli and broccoli sprouts called sulforaphane, which is it's a phase 2 enzyme inhibitor, which is it doesn't cure cancer, it prevents hopefully the formation of cancer in the first place. So because this area, we couldn't just work with people who have cancer. We're not studying whether it cures cancer. We're trying to study whether it helps to prevent cancer, and we're looking at this population that gets cancer at higher rates than most other parts of the world. And so, the thing that was causing that cancer for that area was aflatoxin, which is a toxin produced by a mold. And, more so than anything else we know of, aflatoxin is carcinogenic. It's one of the worst substances known to man. And that's a mold product. And so molds, we kind of think of them because you can scrape them off, right? Like you can just cut around them. Yeah. But the second you cut it off, it fluffs into the air and you start breathing it in. And it's really important to not allow things like that, as much as possible, to not allow things like that to grow in the first place. And once they start to grow, you're really getting into the, it looks like just, like a little bit of mold, but you're really getting into the millions of spores that have reproduced, and those can now fluff off and go reproduce somewhere else. And so preventing, that's part of why cleanliness is such an important issue in the food industry, and you really just want to prevent that formation in the first place.
Could we talk about kegs for a second and that environment? Because the number of disgusting kegs that I have seen, kegs are not such a big deal in Australia, but here in the States, kegs are used pretty much in every cafe. And the number of times that I see people put their cold brew in a keg and then just rinse it out, or the keg sits on the side of the cafe filled with cold brew for 3 or 4 days. You know, right?
So I have a big thing with kegs. It's one of those like out of sight, out of mind things that people get, like, because kegs are sealed. It's like, you
there's no oxygen getting to it, right? It's fine.
Well,
No.
yeah, there's no oxygen, and then like you can just wash it out later. Like you can wash it out tomorrow or the next day, and so people will just leave it. But also, so the purging and cleaning methods for kegs, especially for something like cold brew, alcohol is very different. Our beer is alcohol is a very potent natural antimicrobial, and if we were doing lots of alcoholic cold brew, we'd all be in heaven right now. It'd be a very easy process. But the cold brew can grow all kinds of stuff, but particularly molds and yeast. And kegs are a really great environment for that. They're dark. They get left at room temperature really frequently before they're going to get cleaned. And so what I see happen is people will, wash the interior of the keg and be like, all right, I did it. Like, did the
I threw some sanitizer in there.
Yeah. Well, so the real big issue, and it's something that I've had to train a lot of people on, that dipstick that goes down to the bottom of the keg, that's filled with something that's going to grow some pretty potent yeast and molds if you're just leaving that unclean. But how are you going to go through and clean that? So it's a process of, okay, you put in whatever your detergent is. It's the same as your three sink method for any kind of dishwashing. You throw in whatever your detergent is, and that means that you have to run it through the dipstick too, which means that under pressure, you have to pull all that out of. So what we do here is make cold brew, you put it in a keg. When you're going to rinse it out, you take that keg, you put in detergent, you seal it, repressurize it, shake it all up, and then run it through the entire spout system. And then you take that out and you do a rinse. You rinse that through the entire spout system. Have to repressurize with gas every single time for each step of this, so that you can run all of this through the dipstick. And then you put in your sanitizer, and then you close it off and repressurize and run it through the purge system. And then to get the sanitizer out, you have to you put in your cold brew, and then you do a purge of that cold brew through the system, so that the dipstick is purged and the spigot is purged. And that's a big process.
Oh, yeah.
Be a keg and refilling it regularly. And so what people will do is just, they take it out, they rinse the inside, and then they refill it with cold brew. But that's not, if you did that with your, if you're running a cafe or something, you did that with your anything else in the cafe, where it's like, I left this around for 3 weeks, I'm not going to wash it, I'm just going to rinse it and then refill it. Like you would hopefully intuitively recognize that was a really poor idea, and that you could probably use it in your dishwasher. And so this is the equivalent of running that through your dishwasher. You do need to clean those kegs, and you need to clean the interior of the dipstick as well. And people very regularly don't do that.
Well, the kinds of practice I see with iced teas and with cold brew and all of it is that once that keg is emptied, they'll rinse it out. Rinse it out. They'll take like a liter of water, put it in there, because the keg won't fit under the sink and under the tap and in the sink. So they'll pour some water into it, and then a splash of sanitizer. They'll shake it all around, tip it out, and then add some more water because I've rinsed it now.
Yeah.
Tip it out, then pour more cold brew in there because it's ready to go.
Yeah.
And when I've challenged, go ahead.
No, and that might be very well just fine for the interior, but you have portions of that interior that are harder to get into than just shaking it around for something like a keg. So
and there's a spigot and everything.
Unless you're doing unless you're on you're doing like nitro coffee or something where that pressure is really required. I mean, why not just have a toddy filled with cold brew? Granted, you can't nitro flush it, and then you might see oxidation over a period of time, but so much easier to clean that toddy and comply with all of that cleaning protocol down the line than having a keg where it's possible somebody's going to get lazy about the cleaning of that, because it's such a process. And also it's very wasteful of your gas too. Unless you're doing something where you need that gas, you're repressurizing every time that you're changing over between sanitizer and cleaning fluid and all of that. And so it can be quite a process. And again, with beer, you just don't really need to worry about that quite as much, because you can make your beer, and then if you say like you homebrew, you can make your beer, you can fill a keg with it, you can pour that out. Everything that's in the dipstick, sure, it might get stale, but it's not going to grow anything because of how much alcohol is in it. And so it's, again, taking from an industry that hasn't had to worry about these things and applying it in a new way, just like, the coffee industry hasn't had to worry about food safety that much. And now that they're getting into cold brew, they are. And that's where you see the misapplication of knowledge from another field or another process. And that starts to lead to trouble.
Tell me something. When I moved here to America, was the first time I heard about sanitizer. In Australia, we use alcohol instead of sanitizer. So we have, so when we clean surfaces, when we don't have the 3-sink system in Australia at all. Yeah. Every place has got a dishwasher, like a machine, not a human, but they have that too. And everything's washed with either heat, or we clean all our surfaces with alcohol, like food grade alcohol. Why the difference, do you think?
Chlorine's a lot cheaper than alcohol.
Okay.
So,
but alcohol's more effective, right?
I would say, gosh, I mean, it depends on the dose or the concentration. I really like cleaning surfaces with alcohol. When I'm at home, that's what I do. I use, isopropyl alcohol on countertops and things like that because it evaporates really quickly and, it doesn't leave an unpleasant residue of chlorine and all of that. But it is relatively expensive as a product, and chlorine can also be very easily concentrated. And so you can get tabs or tablets that you can dissolve in water. And so, I can ship you the amount of sanitizer that you need for your business for a year in a package, about the size of my hand. But if you're using alcohol, then we're shipping lots and lots of fluid over long distances. That gets more expensive because it's, heavier. But also, I think, I might not be, I don't know 100% about this, but I think the chlorine's just, cheaper to manufacture, cheaper to produce. And, it makes for a less expensive sanitizing step than your alcohol. You would need a fair bit more alcohol than you would need chlorine.
I found the 3-sink thing very strange. When I moved over here, we don't have 3 sinks, this 3-sink system in Australia, and it's just seems so prohibitive and very strange. And but there's a lot more people here. These are things that you have to kind of like. It's like, Lee, there's 350 million people in this country, and the way that they disseminate information may be very different, and you've got to make sure that everybody knows food safety, et cetera, et cetera. We're only 23 million or 24 million in the whole of Australia. It's a whole different category.
And it also might be that alcohol is easier to, the alcohol that you're using for sanitization is easier to produce, or cheaper where you are, and all, it could be a lot of things. I can't say much for the how all of these food regulations sprung up over the course of history in the United States. It's
some probably had some shares in some detergent companies, and
and honestly, like I've spoken to some regulatory agents about this kind of stuff, and they're always like, gosh, you sit in a room with people who have investments in this industry or that industry, and you're all sitting around making compromises and saying like, okay, well, what if about for food safety we say this, and one person says like, no, that's going to be too much of a burden on my industry, and like, okay, well, what about that? And like, no, it's too much. And so you end up with this like weird system where all these people have a share and a stake in what kind of laws are made around safety, and then you get a weird combination of laws that are not necessarily in everybody's best interest, and not all coming from the same motivation, if that makes sense. Like, if it was all just, what is the most food safe, then I think we wouldn't have such a huge food code.
Oh, yeah.
to deal with.
Look, learning it and understanding it, moving here for me, having to learn new tax systems and new food safety systems, and the things that I learned about food safety in Australia don't apply here, and there are other things that apply here that don't apply in Australia. It's been equal parts fun and terrifying, because the last thing you want to do is operate a business and not be compliant, because especially in a country like America, it's the IRS, customs, and food safety protection boards all scare the shit out of me for no reason. It's just like they're the people who you don't want to have to fuck with.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to be thrown out of the country. I don't want to be put out of business, and I don't want to get in trouble with my taxes. And so I always overdo everything that's required of me to do, because I just get terrified of those organizations.
I think your best bet, if you don't want to be thrown out of the country, is just to make as much money as humanly possible.
Apparently.
We don't like to do bad things to rich people.
That's apparently the way that it goes in
motto in the United States. Yeah.
No, these people have lots of money. Let's not fuck with them.
Yeah, exactly. Just make more money and you'll be fine.
So tell me why all the things that we're talking about in cold brewed coffee, why don't they exist in hot coffee?
Like our microorganisms of concern and all of that. Well, a couple of reasons. So hot coffee is almost always consumed, at or near point of sale, or point of production. So because that brewing process is its own heat kill step, then you have a product that then basically your timer has been reset, right? If I have something wrong with my beans and something wrong with my water, I'm heating all of that up, and as long as all of that gets to a certain temperature, I've pasteurized my product, and then I'm starting again, not quite necessarily from zero, but my microbial load has been greatly reduced, if not, in the case of some microorganisms, just completely eliminated. The microbiology terminology is like a certain a decimal point of kill. So like a 5D kill would be something that reduces 99.999% of microorganisms. We usually don't like to say that something's actually been eliminated, because
you never know.
Conclusive, yeah, exactly. Unless you and it might only be eliminated for that one, versus like the next batch that it might just be greatly reduced. So so for sterilization, we call it like a 12D kill, which is, to make it fun, overkill. Like it's enough to kill like a trillion microorganisms, to get a trillion down to one, to reduce the microbial load that much. And that depends on the microorganism that you're dealing with, is what time and temperature will achieve that kind of a kill. But the way that we're brewing coffee is achieving a pretty significant kill step for almost all microorganisms, at least aerobic microorganisms of concern, so the ones that would exist in a oxygen-rich atmosphere, which is how we're consuming our hot coffee. And once that sort of timer is reset, you then have some time before that's a concern again. If you were to just then leave that coffee out, let it get cold again, and then just do nothing with it, it would eventually grow some mold and some yeast.
Especially if you've got some milk in there and...
Yeah. If you have a more, like proteins make for a much more suitable growth environment for bacteria, because some of them are proteolytic, and so it doesn't mean that it's not a concern. It just means that the way that you're going to consume it and the way that you're brewing it at that moment means that the moment that it's going to be consumed, it's probably fine. You could even probably load up those beans with something disgusting, and as long as you're pouring your boiling water over the top of them, they're going to be all right. So it definitely mitigates almost all of the risk taken by somebody who's, you're gonna find a greater risk in whoever's supplying your milk than what you're doing with at least the black coffee or the espresso.
I was thinking about this the other day. We put so much trust in the products that show up in our cafes and in our supply chain. I mean, we really do just trust that the people who are creating these products for us are taking the duty of care that's required, right?
Yeah. And you know, and people trust us the same way, right? Our products go into somebody else's cafe and they're like, well, seems like a legit business. They got a nice website. Like, probably they're doing it right. And part of that's also trust in the system that, you know, if there was a business that was doing things that was working poorly, that they would be, you know, called onto by the local agencies, or inspections would occur and they would get shut down, or, you know, inspectors don't really love to shut places down because it's a burden on the businesses, and that's your, you know, tax base, among other things. And while there are a lot of regulations, what you frequently say is that places don't really suffer from dramatic inspections or shutdowns until there's been a breach, until there's been some sort of food safety incident. And by then it's usually, you know, can be often too late. Like that Peanut Butter Corporation of America that had the salmonella in their peanut butter, that was considered, you know, they could have been shut down by inspectors, probably who were coming in and seeing the conditions on that place long before. They ended up, I think they killed somebody, and a bunch of people got very badly sick. And the CEO was found criminally negligent and went to jail for it.
God, so, I just can't imagine the stress of having somebody's life on your, like, your product killed somebody.
Yeah, no, it's the bigger you get as a business, the greater the likelihood that that's one of the risks you're taking on. So, you know, that's one of the reasons, you know, and in the case of what they were doing, gosh, peanut butter is like the easiest thing. Like you're creating a completely like almost zero water activity product. Like it's one of the lowest water activity products you can work with, which means that you're risking almost nothing in terms of yeast, mold, and bacteria, and still they screwed it up, which really says something about the conditions in that factory. But you know, that's you know, there are other cases of I think there was a listeria outbreak several years ago in cantaloupes. There was a time when they were saying like, no, should not have any cantaloupes.
E. coli in romaine lettuce.
Yeah, and a lot
that was
of
this
those,
year, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the no romaine, and a lot of those are like, you know, all it takes is for the truck that transports the lettuce or the cantaloupe or something like that to also transport. Let's say like a guy walks in the back of it and he had been to a pig farm a couple of days ago and his boots still had E. coli from the pig feces on them, and now that got onto your romaine, and now you use your romaine in some sort of a salad, and it, you know, it spreads and it grows, and it doesn't take much for that transfer to occur. And I tell people here all the time when I'm like, you know, training people about food safety and washing hands and stuff like that. I really wish, I don't know if you've ever seen these things for teeth brushing, but there used to be these little pills when I was a kid where you'd brush your teeth and then you'd chew on this colored dye.
Yes, the red dye.
It would dye.
That showed you how exactly.
Yeah. So how
is that stuff still legal?
That you did. I have no idea. I haven't seen it since I was like maybe 10 years old. Maybe it was poison. Who knows? But I was always like, gosh, I really wish. I wish there were a way that we could. You could do it for your hands, yeah, and then you could basically treat it as like, okay, here are all of the, you know, bacteria growing on my hands. Now every time I touch anything, it turns red. Every time I touch a cup, you know, if I go to make somebody an espresso and I touch the rim of that cup when I'm going to,
absolutely,
you know, then I'm transferring that bacteria or norovirus or, you know, flu virus or whatever onto that cup. And then that person's going to put their lips right there. And then if I wash my hands, I can reset it. But then every time I touch my face, my hand would turn red again. Every time I touch my mouth, every time I go to the bathroom, it would turn red again until I wash my hands again.
My professor made us swab each of our fingers, as well as our face, the inside of our mouth, the back of our knees for some weird reason. And we had to culture all of the bacteria from each separate. And we quadrangled a petri dish with agar, and just swabbed everything, each of our fingers and everything that I said. And he said, now just incubate it. And I want you to see exactly the amount of bacteria. We just let it incubate until our next lab, and it was shocking. It was shocking the amount that was on there.
We did that in my public health program too, where, you know, like they caught us after lunch and they were like, okay, you just ate, go ahead and wash your hands. And even after you wash your hands, go ahead and put your fingers on this Petri dish, and we'll see how good a job you did washing your hands. You know, and they had some people use liquid hand sanitizer, and some people, you know, wash traditionally. And you would just like dab your fingers down onto this Petri dish, and then, you know, next week come back and they would bring in those Petri dishes. And the thing is, like, you gotta have a really good facility to do that, because you know, one of the reasons, like, we're not gonna culture our own stuff here. When I was in the lab at UGA, they had this whole section of the facility that was where they grew things like listeria. Well, listeria can cause spontaneous abortion in women. And so it was like, if you are pregnant or think you might be pregnant, do not go into this lab. And so, you know, if you're risking something where you're going to culture things, you're growing them out into the millions.
Very quickly too.
Very quickly, yeah. And then you're creating, you know, in a perfect environment on this Petri dish. And unless you have like a retort or something that can, an autoclave that can kill all of those bacteria, now you really risk all of your food products, because you know, there are quick measures. There are little like quick Petri dishes you can use to get a count for, you know, yeast and mold. So you can like put some of your cold brew on it and see what you get in yeast and mold. But then what are you going to do with that Petri dish?
Right. Just throw it in the bin?
No.
And let that bin sit there for, you know, the rest of the day until the trash comes out. Exactly.
And then it goes into the trash, and some poor trash collector is sitting here handling this, you know, like Petri dish full of something that's going to, like, you know, maybe be horrible for their lungs, or, you know, give them some sort of illness. And so you're really charged with, if you're doing that kind of work, you better have a good facility to handle
absolutely
those kinds of microbes. So
tell me about parasites, because that example that you gave of the pig farmer, sorry, the person who'd been on a pig farm and then you know, happens to infect the romaine lettuce. I'm thinking a lot about parasites at the moment. I went through this process of trying to figure out what's going on with my brain fog. And first I was like, is it because I've been vegan about 8 years ago? It turned out that I'm just about to get some testing done to finally confirm the mold. But I did at one point consider that it may have been a parasite that I had. And who knows, like, we've all got a bunch, you know, a whole scope of flora inside of our bodies. So, you know, I'm not dismissing that, but I really do think that the main thing that's going on with my personal brain fog is mold toxicity. But with regards to food safety and parasites and the transferability of those parasites, I don't think people take it seriously enough. They're washing your hands after you go to the restroom, especially when we're serving customers.
Well, for the sake of parasites, I mean, this is certainly not my area of expertise, and I haven't worked with parasites hands-on ever in my career, but most of what I've seen in terms of where parasites are concerned in the food chain is our pork, which is one of the reasons why we're required to cook pork to a certain level. You don't see you know, the same way that you know, pork can have parasites actually like living inside the muscle tissue, as can some fish. And so you don't see raw pork products advertised the same way that, like, sometimes raw beef products, you know, and it's like, oh, you might get sick from this, but as long as you sear the outside of it, the interior of the muscle should be relatively sterile in terms of any parasites or pathogens that might get you sick. But pork is not that way. It's why we're required to cook all the way through for pork. It's one of the reasons why for things like I use sushi fish, the freezing process can be really important, because the freezing process can actually help to kill parasites. They're a little bit more like us than, you know, bacteria or fungi. And so if they get frozen to a low enough temperature, it can actually destroy them. And so for parasites in food, I think I've primarily heard about like fish and pork being the concerns. I don't know of a lot of cases in which we have, I don't think about it, but I could say, you know, one of the primary concerns, which we don't see a lot in the United States at least, for parasites in food, especially in coffee, is like cat cafes.
Yeah, never thought about that.
Yeah, so the parasites that are in the feces of cats can be very harmful to pregnant women. And so that's why, you know, once you get pregnant, if you have a cat in the house, you usually let your partner or your other children or somebody else deal with the cat litter. But it's also a reason why, you know, we don't see a lot of cat cafes in the United States, but you do see them in other parts of the world sometimes. And for good reason, if you have cats in an area where you're also producing food, you really are taking a risk there, because you know, it's not like the bottoms of their feet are clean. Certainly they're not.
No.
You know, especially if they fit into like a litter box, and they're gonna get up on counters and up close and personal with customers and things. And so that's probably like, to think about parasites in the coffee industry, that would probably be my first inclination. Well, is cat cafes.
The other one is, you see it a lot here, and I see it in other cities that I go to in the States, where people just walk their dogs into cafes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the dogs, at least for parasites, dogs don't transmit parasites through fecal contamination the same way
that
they
don't?
cats do.
Okay,
it's a cat-specific parasite. Yeah. I have never had a person walk a cat into our cafe. But then again, I know not a lot of people taking their cats for a walk. So for the sake of dogs, it's more, it would be like anything else where you're just concerned about bacterial contamination. And you know, something like E. coli or norovirus, those are things primarily spread through fecal oral transmission. So the bacteria, you don't wash your hands well enough, and then you transmit it to somebody else. You've been sick, and therefore you're shedding that virus through your feces, and then you go and touch something, you know, even a week after you've been sick, and you can transmit that to somebody else. It's one of the reasons why cruise ships are always such a disaster for food safety, because everyone's confined to a small area, and all it takes is for one person to get badly sick, and they've got like 2 weeks where they're shedding this virus constantly. And in such a small space, you're really bound, especially with a lot of buffets and things, you're bound to have some fecal oral transmission of things like norovirus. And so, but that would be, I think, my main concern for dogs going into a facility is that, but I mean, and maybe like allergens for people or something, but the dog is much less likely to like jump up onto the cafe counter. You know, like it's much easier to keep the parts of the cafe where you're counting on them being clean, to keep those parts clean.
So with regards to that, Lucia Solis was, I don't know if you know about Lucia, she's a microbiologist, and she works at Origin a lot, and particularly with fermentation of coffee. And she did an Instagram stories recently about dogs on coffee farms and how that's not a good idea. Having animals around on coffee farms, because they can contaminate your crops.
Yeah.
So tell me, would the roasting process get rid of a lot of those contaminants, do you think?
Yeah, pretty well. The temperatures that we're going up to for roasting are
parasites as well, do you think?
Pretty destructive. Oh yeah. Yeah, there's not much surviving that roasting process. The things that are concerning that might survive the process are the products of living organisms, not the living organisms themselves.
The spores?
So, yeah, so not even the spores. So that's gonna
the mycotoxins.
Yeah, something like mycotoxins, where a toxin that's already been produced might survive that heat treatment process. And certainly roasting is not powerful enough to get rid of all mycotoxins. There's been some concern in the coffee industry about getting like mycotoxin-free coffee and stuff like that. My research into that has suggested that maybe it's blown out of proportion a little bit, that the levels of mycotoxins that we would get through roasted coffee are really unconcerning compared to things that we're getting through other foods that we're eating. And at a certain point, you've got to kind of accept that like they're all like natural biological products, and that's going to come with a risk, no matter what it is you're eating. Too much of anything is gonna have a negative impact on you. And so I've at least personally come to feel that the concern for mycotoxins in coffee, as long as we're keeping our water activity of the beans or our moisture contents of the beans low enough at shipping, then it's been a little blown out of proportion. I think the Bulletproof diet was the one that was really touting mycotoxin-free coffees. And so,
yeah,
I don't see a lot of value in that.
So should people be asking the water activity of the coffee, of the green coffee that they're buying?
No,
no, we don't need to care.
No, I mean, if you're drinking anything that's, non-sugared black coffee, you're in a very high water activity. Anything that's water-based, that's not like sugared, like even juices, very high water activity.
Okay.
And that's always going to be the potential for growing yeast, mold, and bacteria. So, if you were, the area where it would start to become safe is like when you start to get down to like 0.7, and by that time you're not a liquid anymore. You're
okay.
I've worked in chocolate here and there too, and the water activity of like a ganache, the filling, that still can grow mold, but that water activity can be like 0.8 or so, and that's nowhere near liquid, but still enough to produce mold and be concerning, where you still want to have a limited shelf life for that product.
So talking about chocolate, which is what I wanted to talk about next. I love chocolate. You have done something very exciting that I can't wait to taste. Tell me about it.
So we have partnered up with a local bean-to-bar chocolate producer called Condor Chocolates. And it's a really great business that they're the brothers who own it, Nick and Peter. They are both half Ecuadorian. Their mom is Ecuadorian, and so they're both really into food. Peter's got a bunch of restaurants here in Athens, Georgia. He's a great chef. But Nick really spearheaded this Condor Chocolates, which is chocolate and sourced from Ecuador. He very graciously broke the mold a little bit for us, not to make a pun or anything, but so what I wanted to try, I'd seen it done in some experiments before with other folks, but what I really wanted to try was taking coffee and making a bar out of it. So the idea is basically chocolate. You can think of a chocolate bar as 3 ingredients. Usually it's actually 2. It's a cocoa bean and sugar as for dark chocolate, or it's just the cocoa bean itself, and that would be just 100% dark. But if you think about a normal chocolate bar, it's basically 3 ingredients. You have the cocoa butter, which is a natural part of the bean. You have the cocoa powder, which is everything that makes it brown, and also what makes it taste like chocolate, which is why we use cocoa powder for making bakery items taste like chocolate. And then you have the sugar. And so what we did was we kept the cocoa butter and we kept the sugar, and then we just replaced the cocoa powder with coffee. And our very first batch, we'd done this big collaboration with a local brewery where we were doing Creature Comforts is a great brewery around us. They do a Cocoa Bunny, which is a milk porter that's got chocolate, coffee, and coconut. Absolutely delicious coffee that we could do once a year. And so we go through and pick out what coffees are going to be really great for that beer. And we're already, working with Condor on that project because they supply the chocolate and we supply the coffee for this beer. It's a really cool combination of like Athens local things, which I love.
Wow.
But we were like, okay, that'll be a great place to start. And I think at that time, our Cocoa Bunny blend for our coffee was primarily Ethiopian. And so it was quite acidic. This coffee was quite acidic. And when we made the bar, we noticed a couple of things. Number one, it was really, really bitter, and the other one that it was like acidic enough to the point where it sort of like settled in your stomach like a weight. And so we're thinking, okay, it works. Like, you know, we can make this into a bar. We can grind this coffee down. We can melange it just the way that you would do with chocolate, but and it works as a product. It comes out of its mold. It can temper all of that stuff, but it's way overly bitter, and probably we shouldn't be using an Ethiopian coffee for this if we're trying to reduce the acidity. And so we ended up going with a Nicaraguan coffee. And so we tried it again, and we used this great farm, Gold Mountain in Nicaragua, and this great friend who, Ben Weiner, who runs the farm there, runs the beneficio there. And so we sourced some coffee from them. The farmer is Don Francisco, and so we call it the Don Francisco Coffee Bar. Was a little bit more, what we were looking for was a coffee that has a little bit more chocolate forward notes, because, you know, we want it to
enhances it
to chocolate. But one of the challenges that we had was, you know, when you go through the roasting process, once you start to get above 310 degrees, you're getting mired reaction products, and that's creating, and caramelization products that when you get higher than that, and that's creating bitter compounds. And so you know, if you take that coffee and you make it into a pour over, you're getting this sort of, hopefully if you've roasted it right, you're getting sort of this ideal concentration of organic acids and bitters and sugars that then, along with aromatics, that are then creating sort of the ideal coffee,
right.
Or at least a nicely balanced coffee. But then you're throwing away all those grounds, because the grounds are, you know, then if the grounds were valuable and they still contained a lot of great stuff, we would keep extracting them.
Yep.
What they end up having left over is a lot of bitters in them. And so what we're realizing was that, you know, through using regular coffee for this coffee bar, we were getting all of that great stuff that we're extracting in the total dissolved solids of our pour over, and then we're also then throwing in tons and tons of bitters that we would normally throw out from a normal coffee. And so the question was, how can we reduce the bitterness of this bean? And so we developed a roasting process that's actually a little bit more similar to how you roast chocolate, which is interesting to me. Chocolate's roasted about 100 degrees Fahrenheit lower than our traditional coffee roasting. And by the way, I do love the Celsius metric system, but unfortunately,
that was so great when we were chatting yesterday and you came out with, you said 50 and I went, wait, Celsius?
So I wholly believe in the conversion to Celsius, but unfortunately, you know, all of the chocolate roasting parameters that have been given to me have been given to me in Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit.
Sometimes I gotta transfer back. So our chocolate is roasted at much lower temperatures. And in chocolate, you have a proportionately much higher amount of fat. So it's actually naturally pretty low in moisture.
Yeah,
so
wow.
It doesn't take much. Moisture is really the enemy of fat when you're talking about chocolate. In order for the bean to temper, and for the bar to temper, to form this nice, you know, glossy, lustrous, you know, good snap, good coming out of molds and everything, it has to form crystals. Basically, the fat crystallizes as it cools, and has to form a specific type of crystal. And you can think about it sort of like packing a game of Jenga back into the box. If you just like throw the pieces back into the box, very, very unlikely that
it's all going to fit.
Pack tight enough to fit. Yeah. So you have to be really meticulous about how you form those crystals. And so having water in that process really disrupts the crystal formation of the fat. So for our, you know, when we were trying to roast our coffee, our next step was like, okay, so we don't want it to be as bitter, so let's under roast it by a lot. But then what we ended up with was a bean that was way too moist, and the water from that much more moist bean, because we hadn't quite made it to first crack, that water from that bean then disrupted the tempering. We couldn't get any of the stuff out of molds. It was all sort of like shattering in a really unpleasant way. And so it ends up looking sort of like slate, and it has these layers to it. It's part of the what we call bloom in the chocolate industry. And so we're like, okay, so we need the bean to be really dry, and we need to blow through that zone with caramelization and mired products. We need to like get through that as fast as possible. So we need to get it to that first crack, but we don't want to spend a lot of time in that zone where it's developing lots of bitter compounds. And so we developed a process by which we get much drier beans. They're really dense. They're really they're super hard. And if you make a pour over out of them, it actually tastes a little bit more like elixir.
Oh, does it really?
It has a little bit more of a tea-like aspect to it than a traditional pour over would. Not super bitter. It's sweet and it's acidic, but it's very light. And so it doesn't have what we normally think of as a black pour over coffee, that aspect. But the beans themselves are well balanced. And so we went through a couple dozen iterations of different roasting profiles, and finally settled on a profile that was going to work really well for this bean, and then also that sort of represented what we needed for the bar to work, and for the bitters to be reduced, and came out with a really great balance. So this is, I keep looking over here because the bar is actually over here. So this is what it looks like now.
Oh, how beautiful is the packaging?
I know. We had a Shannon Ladon Lane was the woman who did all of the art. I think I can put it up here. Yeah. She did this beautiful, this beautiful painting that then we were able to transfer onto the bar. But yeah, it's actually, we're on our third production run.
Wow.
So we've gone through, we started in November. We've gone through a couple thousand bars. We're about to start our third run. So it's done pretty well so far, especially for, we kind of have to explain to people what it is. Like when you say a coffee bar.
Chocolate, but not really chocolate. It's coffee. It's the same as elixir. It's coffee, but not really coffee. It's like tea. It's, I get it.
Well, and the concern is it's got a lot of caffeine to it. And so we want to make sure that people understand, we have a thing on the back that says this is not chocolate, because we want people to pick it up and not serve it to their children by accident, not eat it. So we had a launch party actually in November, and these two women came in late, and they bought a couple of the bars, and then they just sat down and they just started eating them. It was 7 o'clock at night, and they'd gone through about 3/4 of the bar, and we were like, but this is coffee, right? This is very caffeinated. One bar is 5 cups of coffee, and they were both like, oh shoot, no, we came in late, I didn't know. So there's definitely an aspect of you got to warn people about what it is that they're going to be consuming, but it makes for a really fun product, and it makes also it's easy to keep in my bag if I don't get a chance to
have a cup of coffee,
and I need to run out somewhere. I have this on me. And it has the indulgence and the texture of chocolate, but it has a utilitarian purpose because I need that caffeine, right? So I can as a dietitian, I can be like, this is important. I need it.
I love the way that you're just justifying that. Tell me, is cannabis legal in Georgia yet?
No.
See, because that would be the next iteration of that product.
No. Oh, don't you think my brother lives in New York, and don't you think he has asked me?
I was going to say,
that happen.
Because we're thinking about it for elixir. So, here it's legal in California. So don't be surprised if you get a phone call soon about, want to come down and help me figure this out for a weekend.
Yeah, well, that would be a very interesting weekend.
Well, we'll see. I mean, putting some CBD in it would be great, but I don't know, CBD and that would be fine, but keeping it shelf stable with the CBD still being active, and especially because we hot feel and all that kind of stuff. I'm not really sure about any of that, but I'm also not interested in figuring out on my own anymore because I'm wearing far too many hats as it is. At some point, you got to start letting other people do shit for you.
Yep. Yeah, that's a lesson I had to learn. Probably actually still have to learn sometime in the future.
It's a lifelong conversation, lady. I tell you, I just, at some point, I'm going to figure out that I got to let other people do shit for me.
Yep.
Yeah, my thing is finding the right people. I feel that that's the struggle for me anyway. I
completely understand. Yeah, so this was a fun project. This is why I say I like wear a lot of hats here, because I do a combination of, I do all of the educational aspects of things. So, anytime we're doing an outreach event for the public, there's like a science cafe here in town. So I presented for the science cafe, and people at the university wanted to, the ecology and forestry department has a joint session where they invite speakers, and they wanted to talk about environmentalism in the coffee industry, and, about shade-grown coffee, the effects on local wildlife and stuff like that. And so I'm not an expert in all of those things.
You're quickly becoming one. You're becoming the coffee scientist. Especially after this podcast, you will be.
Really quickly. But I really enjoy public speaking, and I really enjoy coffee, and so I end up doing a lot of the education, a lot of the outreach, product development, like with this coffee chocolate thing. We're actually about to start a collaboration with the product development class here at UGA, which is really cool.
Wow.
So they have, their food science department has a class that's all product development, and basically they pitch to local businesses and say, what's a problem that you have? Like, is there a waste stream that you're generating? So like our cold brew generates this waste stream of lots and lots of grounds. What can we do with that, if anything? And so you basically pitch them a problem, and this, team of students is charged with, you have a semester to figure it out, and
that's awesome.
That's viable for that business. And so, I'm doing the collaboration with those guys, and so basically, there are people who are doing, the production of end of things, and there are people who are doing the roasting end of things, and then there's sort of this amorphous, like anything else category.
That's the Juli category.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Hey, there is one part of like the bugs that we haven't talked about, sort of. We have, but on a bigger scale, let's talk about fungus. I know we don't have much time left, but there's a lot more focus being put now on some byproducts of mycelium and lion's mane and all those different kinds of byproducts of different kinds of mushrooms that are now being put into coffees. And as nootropics, or as mild psychedelics that enhance performance, brain function, and all that kind of stuff. Where do you sit on all that kind of stuff? Do you think that could be something that we could bring into the cafe?
I mean, I think it could. Fungi are fascinating.
Oh, hell yes.
The science surrounding them is really, it's a newish field, really. Like, it's a lot of the anti-inflammatory research going on around mushrooms and brain activity and all that stuff. A lot of this stuff is still sort of emerging. We're only just realizing how unique and diverse and potentially beneficial some of these mushrooms really can be. And so I don't know a ton about it. I know a lot of people who are in that field, who are fascinated when I listen to them talk about it. And I know people who have used, it sounds weird to say use mushrooms, but
you do use mushrooms for psychedelics and for a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah, who have made mushrooms like an important part of an actual recovery process from inflammatory diseases. And so it's something that I'm excited to see the emerging research on, but I do not know a ton about what is unique and different about all of these. Just that this is like a big burgeoning field for food science folks to go into, and it has a lot of potential. But I don't see any reason why. I think it's 4-sigmatic. That's
4-sigmatic. Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's the mushroom coffee, and it's got some pretty interesting potential for all purposes, coffee or not.
I heard a podcast with the gentleman that owns 4-sigmatic and came up with it. Have you heard of the Broken Brain podcast?
No.
Check it out. It's one of Dr. Mark Hyman is a functional medicine doctor, and his business partner, who is a marketing guy, Drew. They both have this podcast, and they bring functional people who have products and functional medicine doctors and a whole bunch of people who practice and are associated with functional medicine. They have them on this podcast called The Broken Brain, and they have the guy who owns the Four Sigmatic brand, and he talks about how he came up with the coffee brands around and why it was coffee. And the reason is mostly because coffee is the best way to disguise particularly the bitter flavors of these mushrooms.
Yeah.
So it really does. It was a format that they could present lion's mane as a palatable way to be consumed, putting it with instant coffee.
You know, that's actually so that was sort of how I got into all of this in the first place, was that project that I was working on in China with the anti-carcinogenic broccoli sprouts. My role in that was finding a beverage that would be a good masking agent for the clinical studies. And so it was creating a they had originally put it in mango juice. So it's broccoli sprouts and mango juice, which, as you can imagine, broccoli and mango are not super complementary. Terrible. And so the theory that I came up with was essentially that you know, we taste things and they either taste natural or unnatural or spoiled. And so one of the reasons why I think a lot of times I really love espresso made with Ethiopian coffees, and I love Ethiopian coffees as a whole. But a lot of people don't like them as, you know, lattes or cappuccinos, because that sour aspect of the coffee sort of like mentally transfers to the milk, and people think the milk has gone off.
Yes.
And so if you combine two foods that, you know, when you think about like food pairing, if you combine two foods that are not complementary to each other, it's not just that they're not complementary, it's that the presence of one food you may not attribute the flavors to that food. You might not taste it and think this is broccoli and mango, and isn't that weird together? Or you might, but you might instead think this is mango and there's something horribly wrong with this mango. And so you might misattribute something about the ingredient too. And so what we wanted to do was sort of use that to our advantage and say, okay, we have this broccoli sprout that's really bitter, and it's also got this sort of like pungency to it. And you know, what's pungent? Okay, ginger is really pungent, and so maybe that can hide that pungency. And what is bitter or has like green flavors? So you think about broccoli, and it's like this green vegetal grassy note. Well, mango is certainly not going to fit that profile. And so what if we find some fruits that have, you know, you could account for it by saying like, okay, there's pineapple juice in this, but maybe they accidentally got some of the skin in the pineapple juice. So that's not that unusual. Like
watermelon.
You can taste it.
You
can taste it and think like, you know, that's not broccoli. That's something else that tastes green and grassy. And so that whole goal was finding those complementary flavors and misattributing one thing to another. And doing that research was what got me into the food industry as a whole, because I worked for this company, Sensory Spectrum, to do that thesis work. And I eventually ended up working for that company. It's a great sensory analysis company in New Jersey. And they do, we did all kinds of stuff. I don't know how much you want me to go into?
No, go into it. I mean, I'm fascinated. So yeah.
They do everything sensory. So like, how does this towel feel? How do we describe how this towel feels compared to that material towel?
Wow.
What about perfumes? You know, what are all the sensory elements of perfumes? Everything down to like, you know, odor absorbing diapers. So we had to have people bring in their babies and use our diapers and then smell to see if one had the better odor absorbing capacity. Tampons for the same purpose, or trash bags for the same purpose, all like odor absorbing. So it was a weird variety of work.
Wow.
Very strange variety of work. But a lot of what we did was sensory analysis, and that was where my primary work was. I didn't even drink coffee back then. My primary work when I first started there was working with espressos and working with black coffee. And so I spent many, many hours in the morning doing sensory evaluation of black coffee. And then I traveled around the country doing consumer testing of espresso. And I fell in love with coffee through that. And that's how I decided I wanted to move further into food science. And so all of that sprung up from this weird study
of broccoli and mango.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
How did you land where you are?
So I.
Are you from Georgia?
No, I'm from New Jersey. So I came to Georgia to work with the University of Georgia. I worked there for about 5-6 years. But I realized that I really loved Athens, and most of the food industry jobs are around like New Jersey. There's some other places. I worked for Frito-Lay for a period of time in Texas, but I realized that I really loved Athens, and that I wanted to make something work around here. There's not a lot of food industry around here, but at some point I looked into Thousand Faces Coffee. I already loved the coffee from here. I thought they made the best coffee I'd ever had. And I was interested in getting to know the business better. So I shadowed and interned for a while here. And a lot of the jobs that they had could have been greatly benefited by having food science be an application for what they were doing. And not necessarily, it's not like every small coffee shop or a roaster needs a full-time food scientist. But if you want to grow, if you want to take up a bigger market share and then spread, it's certainly beneficial to have somebody who's doing food science, consulting, education. I think it brings a lot to a brand. And I really appreciate Jan Kozak, who runs our business, that when I pitched this to him and said, I want to be, on staff food scientist, he saw the value in that.
Yeah.
And so, that means that we get to talk more about science. We get to do a lot more outreach. We're at the forefront. We do research. We're doing research with Montclair State University on cold brew right now in New Jersey. And so that's the kind of stuff that I've been able to bring to this business, which I think lends us not only greater credibility with the public, but also, it allows us to advance coffee to
the industry
within the industry. Yeah. And so I think it's important, if you're going to be in the industry, you don't just create things, but you make things better for everyone. And so I really appreciate that he was, willing to take that risk on me as an employee to have at this business. And I hope that it's been a valuable one. But yeah, I wound up here.
Well, I certainly can't be more grateful for the work that you're doing, for helping our business as Elixir, and for helping the people who are listening to this or watching this, who have a keen determination to actually produce a really great product and are getting some inspiration from what you're saying. If you could tell people, if they do want to contact you and hire you or connect with you, how do they go about doing that?
You can send me an email. So it's Juli, Juli, no E, .Bierwirth. My last name is weird, but it's Bierwirth @gmail.com. And I'm glad to work with anyone in the coffee industry who's trying to work through all this stuff about cold brew. It really is an interesting field, and I think it deserves the time and attention that it needs to make this into a product that's well understood. And and I'm interested in other topics in the food science.
We're going to have you on the podcast again to talk about lots of other stuff in the coming years. I
really appreciate being here.
Oh, thank you for coming on. And if you do need to figure out how to get in contact with Juli to hire her, email us as well. connect through our socials, and we'll connect you with Juli. We want as many people in the industry to start taking what they're doing as seriously as possible. And so we will make sure that you get in contact with Juli. But Juli, thank you so much for your time. We can't thank you enough for being so generous, and thank your boss for letting you take time out of your day and we'll give them a shout out. Thousand Faces Coffee. Did I say it right?
Yep.
And keep doing it.
And I'm sure we'll talk soon.
Oh, for sure. Have a great day, Juli.
You too. Bye.
See you later. Bye.